Each morning, it's a new opportunity, a chance to start fresh. Up First from NPR makes each morning an opportunity to learn and to understand. Choose to join the world every morning with Up First, a podcast that hands you everything going on across the globe and down the street, all in 15 minutes or less. Start your day informed and anew with Up First by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts.
Imagine letting a 12-year-old drive your car with no seatbelt and no real understanding of the rules of the road.
Yeah, not happening.
We'd never let kids do something so dangerous. But experts say we are in the digital world. They say evidence is mounting that social media apps are hurting kids' mental health.
If our kids are cutting themselves and killing themselves at much higher levels than they did before, are we going to say, let's not do anything until we're certain? I think the evidence is pretty clear. When you look at the risk-benefit ratio, why the hell aren't we acting?
Now, lawmakers in Washington state are acting, or at least trying to. They want to take the keys away from kids by regulating their access to social media. I'm Monica Nicholsberg.
And I'm Joshua McNichols. And this is Booming. It's a podcast about the economic forces shaping our lives here in the Pacific Northwest.
Today, why are parents, tech workers, and even kids asking for seatbelts on social media?
And can Washington pass safer rules for our digital roads? That's coming up.
People want to go on the internet and check out their friends, so why not build a website that offers that friends, pictures, profiles? I'm talking about taking the entire social experience of college and putting it online.
The site got 2,200 hits within 2 hours.
22,000.
Okay, Monica, let's start with the basics. So I know there's a bill making its way through the Washington state legislature, and it proposes rules that are supposed to protect kids from social media harm. So walk me through what these rules are.
Yeah, so the bill has a lot of support. It looks like it could pass, and it covers a lot of ground, but a couple of things that jumped out to me. It would establish these blackout hours when apps like Instagram would not be able to send push notifications to kids. So between midnight and 6 a.m., when presumably they should be sleeping, and during school hours from September to May.
Okay.
It also tells these companies that you can't deliver what it calls an addictive feed to teens. Basically, that just means the algorithmic feed that we're used to seeing on Instagram and Facebook. So if you remember the early days of social media, it was just a timeline. It just delivered content chronologically based on when it was posted. And they want that to be the default setting for minors, because what happens with an algorithmic feed is the app uses all of this information it collects about you to give you the most juicy, the most addictive content to keep you on longer than you maybe want to be on there. And that's especially concerning for kids.
Yeah, and I know, those feeds can push people down ideological rabbit holes.
Yeah, it's a real concern. And to ensure that these rules actually get implemented and enforced, the bill would require these companies to try harder to actually verify how old a kid is that's using their app. Because, as we all know, kids can very easily lie about their age to access these apps. I know that's something that I did when I was younger. And this bill says that's not going to fly anymore. You need to find a way to reasonably verify how old a person is that's using your services.
Yeah, I know my kids lied to get onto social media about their age. And the reason why is they were afraid of missing out on social interaction with their peers, with their peers that they see physically at school. There was just this whole second sphere of conversation happening that they didn't want to get left out of.
Yeah, that FOMO creates what experts call the collective action problem. You can't be the only one who's setting these rules, at least it's really hard to, when everybody else is in this digital space and your kid is left out. That's why bills like this are being introduced across the country, and the goal is to make social media apps safer for young people, but also to solve that collective action problem, because these are the rules of the road for everybody. It's not putting the onus on individual parents to solve this problem alone.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of recycling. Recycling is sometimes branded as a moral, personal choice, that individuals need to make in order to save the planet. But ultimately it's a systemic problem, a problem of collective action, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And to understand more about what these regulations might mean, not just for kids, but for parents, the companies themselves, really for everybody, I talked to this expert, Ravi Iyer. He's a social psychologist from the University of Southern California, and he actually used to work at Meta doing content moderation. He also contributed to Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, about how social media has played a role in the teen mental health crisis. And I just finished the book, so I was excited to chat with him. Hi, Ravi. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So you've studied the impact that social media has had on young people's mental health and what solutions are available. But for those who aren't as steeped in these issues as you, can you just explain the problems facing kids today and how we got here?
Yeah, so I think everyone who is a parent notices that kids' experiences these days are very different than when we were kids. I have 3 kids myself. You often will walk into a group of kids, they're all hanging out together and they're all staring at their phones. And if you ask a group of kids, are they trying to use their phones more or less? Oftentimes they will say, I'm trying to use my phones less, yet their phones are full of apps that are actually trying to get them to use them more. It's not that different than most adults. Most adults are also having a complex relationship with their phone. The difference is kids are still developing their ability to control themselves. And, a lot of times it's more of a network effect. It's not like kids need to be on these products. They're using them because they don't want to be left out from what their friends are talking about, from what their friends are doing. And so oftentimes if you can solve that collective action problem so that they can stop using these products and not feel like they're missing out on what other people are doing, then I think we can help these kids sleep better and improve their mental health.
Sometimes when we're talking about legislation like this, it can feel a little bit abstract. But walk me through a scenario. Say you have a teenager and they open up Instagram. What are you worried about them experiencing?
Yeah, so first of all, a lot of kids are on these products before they're even allowed to be on these products. So the first thing they do is potentially lie about their age. More than half of 12-year-olds in one study were actually on products like Snapchat and Instagram. Once they're on, 1 in 8 13 to 15-year-olds in an Instagram study reported unwanted sexual advances overall. And so, I'm worried about unwanted contact. I'm also worried about using it more than you want to. And the last is like content you're not ready for. So a lot of people report seeing unwanted sexual explicit content. Your average 12-year-old is not looking for sexual content online, but unfortunately the average age of pornography exposure in this country is age 12. Not because they're looking for it, but they're seeing it accidentally. And so I'm worried about the content they see, the contact they get, and then them using it more than they want to.
How revolutionary is this bill here in Washington? Is there something like it happening in any other states or nationally?
Yeah, this bill is based on similar problems that we're seeing across jurisdictions. So it rhymes with many bills that you see across the country. There's a bill in South Carolina that's being introduced. There's a bill in Vermont. There's a bill in Nebraska. It's passed in Maryland. And so the patterns that this bill is trying to address, the design patterns of companies, are common across jurisdictions. And so the provisions of the bill are also similar. Things like engagement-based feeds that keep you on these products longer than you want, that expose you to content that you're not ready for. So, 19% of kids in one internal meta study reported seeing unwanted sexual content in a 7-day period, right? And so if you do the math, half of kids are on Instagram and 19% of them are seeing unwanted sexual content. That is, millions, tens of millions of kids being exposed to things that they aren't necessarily ready for. And I think that, at that scale, that's a problem we need to solve.
Opponents to this sort of social media regulation argue that it violates First Amendment rights, free speech. But this bill seems like it gets around that by targeting the design of the app and when kids can access it rather than the content itself. Is that a strategy to preempt the free speech restrictions that make it hard to pass laws like this in the U.S.?
Yeah, it's a strategy, but I think it's also a principle that we should care about, right? So, I worked at Meta for some period of time, and I worked on moderation issues, and honestly, it wasn't effective, and we made a lot of mistakes. There's a lot of kinds of content that you're never going to be able to create a policy about what people should or shouldn't do. Like, for example, a picture of a kid in a swimsuit. is probably fine between parents to share, but for a group of older men to start sharing these pictures of kids that they don't know, that's terrible, right? So it's about the context of these kinds of information. It's not about specifically the content. And we need kids to be able to say that I don't want something and not be given more of it just because they happen to, linger on it for a few more minutes.
Were those challenges to put effective policies in place at Meta, was that one of the reasons that you left?
So to give some credit to Meta, Meta has put a lot of effort into figuring out design changes that can be made to make platforms safer. Now, they've never gone as far as I think they should. Nobody at platforms thinks it's a great idea for us to be optimizing children's feeds for engagement. And so the problem is that if you're at a platform and you stop doing that, then your competitors are going to get more market share. They're going to outcompete you. And so in an environment where everyone is incentivized, they're paid bonuses based on how well they are able to get more people to use the platform for longer periods of time, then there is no incentive for anyone to sort of stop this race to the bottom where we're all trying to get kids to use these products more, even when we know it's bad for them. I haven't met anyone at a company who is not uncomfortable with the idea that we're optimizing for as much time as we can get from these kids. And so I think people at companies would welcome some minimum standard that stops that incentive. And I'm hopeful that by leaving Meta, it gives me the opportunity to set minimum standards across platforms rather than trying to fight the battle just within one platform.
You're obviously coming from the perspective that it's important to regulate these things. But I am curious, as a mother of young kids myself, in limiting social media, is there a risk that we're also not teaching them how to use tools that are going to be important to be economically competitive in the future?
So, I mean, there are tools that we all find useful, and there are tools that we don't. And I'm not sure that people find social media as an important tool to be economically competitive. Now, there are things, it's a loose category, right? So like there are, we do research at the Neely Center on where do people learn new things. And a lot of people learn new things on YouTube, but a lot of them do it in a logged out state. They don't have to be logged in to do it. And the law does not mandate that you can't access any particular kind of content. So you should still be able to get the information that you need. You just don't need to be logging into Instagram and getting sort of like an endless feed of whatever. Like, if you want to use it as a tool to achieve a goal, then the law does not restrict that in any way. But it tries to get rid of some of the more manipulative practices, especially for our kids, that I would argue don't really have a lot of economic benefit.
So maybe it's like we can still teach our kids to drive, but they have to wear a seatbelt.
I think that, and, we don't also teach our kids to drive at age 11, right? So we wait a little bit until we think they're ready and where we think that they have the judgment that's needed. And a lot of kids will admit that, like, I'm not ready for that sexual content. I'm not ready to be contacted by strangers. I'm not ready to, control my own usage at night. Like, I could use some help. And so they'll put friction on it, or they'll try to come up with tricks, but like we need to help them, right? Like they are saying they feel manipulated by these products. We need to help them not feel manipulated.
Could this tide of regulation that we're seeing introduced represent a tipping point for the tech industry?
I hope so. I think that the tech industry, needs minimum standards. Like once upon a time, we didn't have minimum standards for cars and we didn't have minimum standards for food, right? And people, you had the Upton Sinclair's The Jungle that like illustrated that why we need minimum standards for how we create meat in this country. And Ralph Nader went and talked about, why do we need seatbelts? And so like we need minimum standards for technology the same way that we needed minimum standards for food and for cars. And ultimately, like cars and food are things that we sort of take for granted as like somewhat safe things. I mean, I'm sure people will quibble with that in some degree, but like, they're not as controversial as some of these online platforms. And that's because, I think government did those industries a favor by creating these minimum standards.
Great. Well, Ravi, thank you so much for talking with me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Hey, I'm Scott Greenstone, and this week on our podcast, Sound Politics, we want to hear your questions about politics. Curious what happens when lawmakers ignore court rulings? Or why are the governor and the legislature getting a raise right now? Email your questions to soundpolitics@kuow.org.
So, Monica, having heard that whole interview now, I've got a few thoughts. I mean, one thing is that, how I alluded to earlier that I knew my kids lied to get on social media.
Yeah.
I also did that in part because I was at the limits of what I could teach my kids, especially my son, who is now a programmer, and he wanted to learn more programming, more than I could teach him. So I allowed him to participate in social media, especially on YouTube, and he trained himself to program on that, watching how-to videos. And in exchange for his earning time on social media, I made him read articles about some of the negative side effects of social media so that he'd be a little bit more prepared for the downside of that world.
I love that quid pro quo.
Yeah. And then my daughter, who's into film, it makes these sort of beautiful collages of images of her friends and the things that they do together that I feel like has some real utility in her future professional life. I also see how it can keep a kid in their room for several hours in ways that look unhealthy to me. But, so I do see the pros and cons of it. And I don't want us to get to a place where we just ignore all the pros of social media.
I'm glad you raised that point because I think I come to this from the more knee-jerk fear, anxiety side of it. My kids are really little, but I think about this a lot. I don't post pictures of them on social media, and my rule for the house right now is just I don't want them consuming any media that's delivered to them by an algorithmic feed. I don't want companies to learn about them and use this huge power imbalance of everything they know to get them more hooked on these apps. But I do worry and fear going too far. I think there's a risk of making it forbidden fruit, and then there's also a risk of depriving them of skills and tools that they're going to need in this world. Plus, socially, if all of their friends are on here and they're not, I don't want them to feel isolated. It's that collective action problem. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that these regulations are attempting to take social media away from anyone, really, except maybe very young kids. I think that they are just an effort to set some minimum safety standards like Ravi talked about.
Yeah, and I guess you don't have to be logged into YouTube in order to see videos about programming.
Yeah, I think YouTube's in a slightly different camp, although, you mentioned your daughter on Instagram. What really stood out to me talking to him is just how many stakeholders are actually asking for a floor here. There are tech workers at these companies who know and feel kind of icky about the fact that they are doing everything they can to keep very young people staring at their phones as long as possible. I don't think anybody really feels good about that, but there's this fear that if we don't, our competitors will, and then they'll have these kids as lifelong users. Mm-hmm. And also really interesting is that the kids themselves seem to be screaming for this, asking for help. I mean, what could be a bigger sign that something is addictive and beyond their control than them saying to the adults in their life, please give us some rules? I mean, when does that ever happen?
Yeah. I guess we don't let kids wander into casinos where there's no daylight, so they don't know what time it is, and they're pumping oxygen in the room so that they're stimulated.
I mean, yeah, even though maybe you could make the case that learning strategy-based games has some real-world value. I think there's a more compelling case that the risks outweigh the benefits here. Not to the extent that we should completely take these tools away, but that there should be some rules in place.
Okay, what happens if these state-level regulatory efforts fail?
They could, and if they do, I would expect the bills to be reintroduced again the next session. I think, big picture, it's only a matter of time before some sort of minimum standards are set. If you think about other industries throughout history where we sort of woke up to the dangers like cigarettes or automobiles, it's hard to quiet the calls for regulation in that case. It might not be a linear path. There might be bills that succeed and bills that fail, and it's one step forward and two steps back, or even that a patchwork of states pass so many regulations it finally gets the federal government to do something. But I don't really think we're going to be in this Wild West era of social media anymore.
Well, so this bill feels kind of new, but if you can imagine a more distant future, what do you think is next? What do you think is the next field of battle for tech regulation?
I think that there's a phenomenon that happens when there's a danger, and the efforts to rein it in often start with kids. This was true of cars. There were a lot of traffic deaths, but the thing that we really couldn't tolerate was a lot of kids dying. And so there was a big push to get seatbelts in cars and car seats in cars. And then we realized, the adults could use some protecting too. It was sort of a tide that lifted all ships. And I could see the same thing happening here. This is an area where there's rare bipartisan support. People across the aisle agree that something should be done to protect our kids and that we should prioritize that above, partisan politics. Eventually, I could see those same rules being extended to some extent to adults. And there's a great example baked into this bill that's in the Washington state legislature right now. The bill was written to set these minimum safety standards for minors, but there's part of it that says these companies would also have to give adults the option to opt out of the algorithmic feed, to go back to just having a traditional timeline that's less addictive.
Yeah, like I already have that option set up on Blue Sky. Like I just look at a timeline of the people who I follow's posts.
Maybe it's the beginning of a new era. As always, thanks for listening to Booming.
We love getting email questions, and here's a little secret. Sometimes we use the questions we get as fuel for episodes. So if you want to try to get your idea in there, you can reach us at booming@KUOW.org.
Also, special thanks to those of you who donated to the show during KUOW's Spring Pledge Drive. If you didn't get a chance, you can still give by going to KUOW.org/booming. And thanks.
Our producer is Lucy Suchek. Our editor is Carol Smith. I'm Joshua McNichols.
I'm Monica Nicholsberg, and we'll see you next time.
Hey, I'm Ton Vin, host of Seattle Eats, a food podcast from the Seattle Times and KUOW. It's fun to grab drinks on a Friday night or go out for date night on a Saturday. But if you want the best deals in the city, think about a weekday trip. On the latest episode of Seattle Eats, I share the top 5 meal deals around the city and explain why restaurants offer them. Listen to Seattle Eats on the KUOW app or wherever you get your podcasts.